Hello, I'm Li Hao. So today I'm going to talk about Component API in Svelte. More specifically, client-side Component API. So what is that about? So let's take a look at one example where over here I have app.svelte and I'm importing component.svelte. The component has all the things that we have talked about previously. For example, dispatching events, having props, having reactive statements, and some UIs, binding, event listeners, and all these things, right? So this component, when we import, we write import component from component.svelte. So in this statement, we can see that the component that we just written in this component.svelte file is exporting a component that you can use in a default export. Right here, imagine if this is normal JavaScript module, then this would be your default export, right? So we're importing default export, importing a component, and we just write this, and we can use this component on the fly. Of course, this is in the app.svelte. But what if you want to use this component and use it somewhere else? So we know that a component, if you look at the JavaScript output, it says that it's a class that is being exported, right? So we want to use this class somehow mount on somewhere else by ourselves. So what do? Well, we will just instantiate this class and use it. And that is the component API that we're going to talk about. In this example, we're going to talk about how we can use this class, what are the API that we can use, and for example, how we can update the props, as well as how we can listen to events coming from the component. So here it's a bit limited to do this in the REPL, so I'm going to download this file, download this project, and uncompress it, and I'm going to use it and open it on VS Code and do it over here instead. Okay, so here we've seen that in the main.js file, this is the main file of your application. Over here, we can see that we are importing app from app.svelte, and we are actually instantiating the component like this. So there are some properties that you can pass in for the app, right? If we remove this line, if we just do nothing, don't do anything from here, you'll see that now there's nothing shown on the screen. Right, so this part is where it will attach or mount your app component onto the screen. So what I'm going to do here is I don't want to use this. I want to use my component directly because the component I've written has props, has event listeners, has component events, and we're going to play with that instead. Right, so here I'm going to import the component directly. And now, just like how we did for app.svelte, we are going to mount this component onto the screen. So I'm going to say app equals new component and target document.body. Right, so how about just use component instead of app. So now if we split the screen into two parts, you'll see that we can still see the components on the screen, right? So here, the first thing we're gonna take a look over here is what can you pass in as the parameters for your constructor, right? You are constructing this component instance, and what can you pass in? So the first thing we can see is we can pass in an object, and the first property we can see is target. So target is where you are mounting your components. So if we come over here, inspect element, if you take a look at the HTML, let me try to zoom this up. Right, let me close everything else. If you try to expand, you realize that now the component is mounted on the document body, right? This div is what we've written over here in the component.svelte, right? Exactly the same div with a grid, right? So let's try to play with this. Let's try to mount it somewhere else. So let me open this file in the HTML file. I'm going to add some div over here. I'm going to add maybe like header. well, hello component API. And I'm gonna come over here and then create a div or maybe a main tag, right? Main content will be added over here in the main tag, and then maybe some footer over here. So here I'm gonna put a second heading, a footer, right? Footer, examples prepared by Lihao. Okay, so I have a title, main tag, and a footer. Right, by default, you will realize that because we are adding we are mounting the components on the body itself, so it will be appended to the body, right? So here you see that all this h1 main footer is still intact on the screen, but then the components, right? This div is the component is being attached, appended at the end of the document.body. Right, so now we can change this target to the main element instead. So we can do document.querySelector main. And now if I refresh, realize that this component is being sandwiched between the header and then a footer, right? So now inside main is where you see the component. Okay, so how do you know all this is you can come over here to the Svelte document, and you probably can, you can probably scroll all the way down to find client-side components API. Then you'll probably find that it says target is where the HTML, the elements of the component will be rendered to. Right, then you also can find things like props. So props is something we can pass in as well. So over here, I'm gonna since we in a component of Svelte we have two props, right? A and B. So the default value of the props is 1 for both of them. That's why when you created the components, it says 1, right? So now how about let's just try and add some props to this component, props. Let's say A equals to 5 and B equals to 10. And I save this. You realize that now it's being rendered with 5 and 10 as a props value, and now the product is 50, right? So here is how you can pass in the props. If you don't have props, then it will use the default value of the props. Okay, fair enough, right? So if we take a look over here again, it says context. You can pass a context for your components. So say for example, if I have my components over here and say get context. And my context, I am going to get a value called C equals get context C. Okay, I'm gonna show this value C value over here on the screen as well. Okay, say C. Okay, maybe put it at the end. C. Okay, so if we see C is right now undefined, and we can come over here and say context, and we can create a new context is where we can pass in a map. It's here it says default is an empty map, so you can create a map with some value in it, right? So I can create maybe I create a new variable called context equals to new map. And context.set C equals to 20, right? And then I pass this context. I save this, and then you'll realize that now C is 20 because C is the context will be read from this map that we just created. Right. Of course, if you don't like to write so many lines of code, you want to have a more compact code, then of course your map can be instantiated directly with key value pair. So here I'm gonna say C and 20. Right. So here, just like a explanation of how this works is that you can pass in an array of key value pairs, so you can have as many key value pairs over here for your map that you're creating. And since we are doing this why not we just inline this whole thing over here. This would work as well, right? If you really like a very compact code for some reason, right? So just now I was trying to like explain, you can pass in a map and create in. Now it's just like, yeah, one liner. Okay, so we can pass in our props that we want. We can pass in context. What else can we do over here? Anchor says that this is a child that the render immediately before an element, right? So for example, over here, if I come over here and say, previously we will say document body, right? We were rendering at the body. So by default, it will be appended at the end of this body. So you see h1 main footer and then the components that we just written. But we can add an anchor, and say where we want to anchor. Anchor meaning this will be this component will be inserted right before the anchor. So here, if I say, if I come over here and maybe query for the footer, right? Document query selector footer, save, and realize that this component is inserted right before the footer, right before the footer. So anchor is where you want. So by default, when you're inserting to the target, you're appending this components at the end of the children. So if there's existing children, you will add at the end of the children list. But anchor says that you want to add into as my children, but before something else, right? So if you're familiar with the DOM API called insert before, this is how this is being used by when you're trying to insert elements, right? So anchor is like insert this components before an anchor. And by default, anchor is null, then insert before. If you pass in a null, actually you're inserting at the end of the list. So there's nothing unique or special over here. Okay. So let's take a look what else we can do, right? So hydrate and intro, right? Hydrate is when you want, when your HTML already has something in it, and you want to hydrate it, right? Meaning, if you use a server-side rendering, and then you probably will want to specify hydrate equals to true, and you want to hydrate the existing HTML DOM elements with your components, right? Probably we'll explain this more extensively when we talk about server-side rendering. All right, so let me just remove this for now. Then what else? Okay, so lastly, intro. By default is false, right? So what is intro? Say for example, if I come over here and try to import fade from Svelte transition, and I add fade transition to my component. Okay, by default, if I try to refresh this, you don't see any fading, right? Although I'm adding this transition fade to the component. Why? That's because by default, when you the first time when you try to show the component, the transition will not be played by default. Right? Of course, if you come over here and maybe add another variable called d equals to true for initially, and we're gonna use this d to try to show a height the whole component content, and then I maybe create a checkbox. Now I notice when I refresh the page, there's no transition being played at all. But now if I try to turn it off and turn it on, you see that the component is fading, right? But then the first time when you see on the screen, there's no fading being played, right? I refresh, no fading is being played. So this is, to some people, this is not what they want, but to most people, this is good, right? Because you wouldn't want, at first glance when you try to add components, everything is fading, right? This is some like the initial content, it should be just there. Of course, if you want to change this behavior, then this is where the intro useful, right? Remember, if we look at the docs, by default it says false, says that it will not play transition on the initial render, right? It will not play, but if it's true, you will play transition on initial render. So if I come over here and say intro to true, I save this, okay, and I try to refresh, you see that if you take notice of here and I refresh, you'll see that the intro fading is being played. Right, so this is how this intro is being useful, right? So even if we don't have this at all, we don't have any condition, we have just our components with a transition, the transition will be played during the intro, during the initial mounting of your component. Right, so here basically we covered all of the options that is available in your constructor, but let's move on to other things that we can do with the components instance itself, right? Because when we try to initialize this, instantiate this component, we have the component instance, and this component instance actually we can do certain things to it. So for example, if I take this component and come over here and try to do something, right? So before we do something, let's add some buttons through the HTML, the traditional old school way, adding some buttons over here. I'm gonna add one button called ID random. Okay, I'm gonna say ID equals random. Randomize. Okay, so old school way, we create a buttons, and now we want to add some. We are gonna add some event listener to this button. So I'm gonna say document.query selector random, add event listener, click. Okay, not sure you can see this clearly. Let me try to expand it bigger, wider. And let's just make this narrower so that, okay, hopefully you can see the whole line. Okay, now I have my function. Let's do something with this, right? Okay, so when I click on the buttons, what I want to do is I want to randomize the props. So I want to pass the different values to A and B. So first thing is, how do I pass values to A and B? What I can do over here is I can come over here and say component.set and set the props value. So set is a method for you to actually set props value to the component. So here I can say A equals to 20 and B equals to 70, right? So save. So when I click randomize, you'll see that it will change A to 20 and B to 70. So I want random, right? So probably I can math.random, and then let's see, times 100, math.floor. So I get a nice round integer number in a range from 1 to 100. So let me save this. So now I randomize, you can see that this is changing A and B, right? Every time when I click. So this is useful when, for example, now we are not being restricted on just using a Svelte component in another Svelte component. You can actually take this component and use it anywhere, right? So for some reason you have an existing React app or have existing PHP application, Ruby on Rails, any framework that you have existing, if you want to just have a very small part of it being written in Svelte, then you can compile your Svelte component, right? You can import your Svelte component, and if you compile it using a Svelte compiler, what you get is a Svelte component class, right? So you import that class, you try to instantiate this class, and you can pass all these things like say props and context into it, and you can use it, and you can still interact with your component by setting the props. Right? You can set the props with this component, and if you watch my video about props, there are two types of props. One is like normal variables. There are also what I call a component methods. For example, if you export function, say do something, what this will do is I'm gonna say, okay, instead of do something I call resets, this will reset a and b equals to 1. This component method can be also used by from your component instance over here, right? So here I can come over here, maybe have another button called reset, and I'm going to call this method reset. Right? Let me save this. Let me add another button called reset. Okay. So here I have two buttons, randomize, I can change the value, and reset, and we'll reset everything back to 1. Right? So I can interact with these components by setting the props or getting some component methods and call it directly. Right? So the last thing I want to show you is how do you listen events, component events being dispatched from this component itself. So here I'm dispatching a product event. The name of the event is called product. Right? So here I want to listen to it. What I can do is I can come over here and say component dot on and pass in the name of the event. So this is called product, and I can get event listener. And the let me think. Let me just console out the data, right? So console logged product event events.detail, right? Events.detail is where you can get the detail of the product, which is the data that you're going to pass it over here, which is the product itself, right? So here, let me open my console. Let's show the console at the bottom. Let me hide my head, and let's see. So here, every time when I change a value, you notice that the product event is being triggered, and you get the detail of the events, which is now the value is 70. Right? Of course, you can pass more things. Say product. Oops. Product. Oh, about product A and B. Can pass in all these things in here. And so every time when you change, you get products A and B, right? So you get data coming out by listening to events. So I believe this is almost everything that you can do with the components, right? You can set the props or call functions or even listen to events coming out from the component. So lastly, here we introduce how you can mount the components, but what if you have some buttons that you want to do where you want to unmount a component, right? How do you unmount your component? That will be calling the destroy method, right? So first thing, so destroy will be here in the docs, right? Destroy. So first thing is I am going to create a button for that. Let's say destroy. Okay, so upon clicking on this destroy button, whoops. Let's see, destroy, ID is destroy. I'm gonna call destroy. Okay, so once it's being destroyed, it will be removed and it will be it. You can't mount a component back again anymore. You have to create a new component because the destroy will do all the cleanup. For example, remove any event listeners being added for the component. It will stop everything. You will call the on destroy component lifecycle events and things like that. And it's the best for you to just recreate a new instance and mount it on the script DOM. Right, so that's why when you create the component, you have to pass in a target, and like when you create an instance, it's like it should be immediately mounted on the DOM. And when you destroy, there's no more mount method that you can call or anything else. Right, so now let's take a look over here. If I come over here, I click destroy, and this whole thing is being removed, and that's it. If you try to inspect or take a look or anything, it will be gone, right? You won't see this anymore, and you have to create a new component instance. I see in the docs that says like component props. I believe this we talked about this before. If you remember the video, I talked about Svelte options called accessors. Links will be in the description if you haven't watched that video. So if you use an set accessors to true, then you will also not you will get a getter and setter method for your props. So not only you can set it with a $set method, you can also directly access the value of A or set A directly as if this component property like this, right? So that's all for this video. Hope that you learned something about this. If you have any questions, feel free to comment down below. And as always, subscribe to my channel so that you get notified when the next video is out. So see ya, bye bye!